Edmund Hale had always believed that a man could judge another person's character in a single moment of crisis. He believed loyalty showed itself plainly, like sunlight through a window, and that dishonesty, once seen, could never be unseen. This belief had served him well in business and in his duties as Duke of Ashworth. It had earned him a reputation as a fair but unshakable man. What he did not know, on the cold morning his wife Catherine returned home after 3 unexplained days away, was that this same belief would nearly destroy the only happiness he had ever truly known. Catherine had left without warning on a Tuesday evening. She had told the housekeeper only that she needed to visit a sick relative and would return soon. She took no maid with her, which was unusual, and she left in a hired carriage rather than one of the estate's own, which was even stranger. Edmund had been away in London that week, attending to matters of business, and when he returned to find his wife gone, his first feeling was worry. By the second day, worry had turned into something colder. By the third day, when she finally walked through the front doors of Ashworth House, pale and exhausted, with dark circles beneath her eyes, his worry had hardened into suspicion. "Where have you been?" he asked her, standing in the entrance hall with his arms crossed. "I cannot tell you," Catherine said quietly. "Please, Edmund, do not ask me again." It was the worst possible answer she could have given a man like him. Edmund had spent his entire life surrounded by people who flattered him, who told him what he wanted to hear, who rarely dared to refuse him anything. A simple, "I cannot tell you," struck him like a slap. He searched her face for some sign of guilt, some crack in her composure that would explain everything. He found only exhaustion and a strange, steady sadness that he mistook for shame. "You owe me the truth," he said. "I am your husband." "I know," she whispered, "and I am sorry, but this is not my secret to share." Those words convinced him more than anything else could have. Not my secret to share. To Edmund, this sounded like the language of betrayal, the careful phrasing of someone protecting another person. A person, he assumed, that Catherine cared for more than she cared for honesty with him. He did not shout. He did not demand to know the name of whoever she was protecting. He simply turned and walked away. And from that day forward, something inside him closed like a door being locked. In the weeks that followed, Edmund moved Catherine's belongings to the east wing of the house, a part of the estate rarely used, and far from his own chambers. He instructed the staff to address her formally, as the Duchess, rather than by her given name, which had once been spoken so warmly in that house. He stopped sharing meals with her, except when guests required their presence together, and even then, he spoke to her only when necessary, with the cool politeness one might show a stranger. Catherine never fought against this treatment. She accepted the silence, the distance, the cold formality, as though she believed she deserved it. She did not write him letters explaining herself. She did not beg for forgiveness or attempt to defend her actions. She simply continued living in the house, quiet and dignified, and this composure only deepened Edmund's certainty that she was guilty of something terrible. He considered, more than once, ending the marriage entirely. An annulment would have been scandalous, the kind of event that filled drawing rooms with gossip for months, but Edmund told himself he did not care. What stopped him, in the end, was not love but pride. He did not want the world to know that his wife had humiliated him. He did not want to admit, even to his lawyers, that he did not know exactly what she had done. So the marriage continued in name only, a hollow arrangement of 2 people sharing a house but nothing else. 5 years passed this way. Edmund grew older and more guarded, his heart wrapped in layers of suspicion that no one could penetrate. He attended social events alone, claiming his wife was unwell, though everyone in their circle understood the truth behind the polite excuse. Catherine, for her part, grew quieter still. She filled her days with small tasks, tending to the gardens in the East Wing, reading in the library when Edmund was away, occasionally visiting the tenants on the estate, who remained fond of her despite the rumors that swirled through the great house. The staff adored her, though none of them understood why their master treated her with such coldness. She never complained to them, never spoke ill of Edmund, and this loyalty, this refusal to defend herself even when given the chance, made the household staff quietly suspect that there was more to the story than anyone knew. What none of them knew, not Edmund, not the staff, not even the wider family, was the truth of those 3 missing days, a truth that had nothing to do with betrayal, and everything to do with love of a different kind. Catherine's younger sister, Margaret, had always been the more impulsive of the two. Where Catherine was steady and careful, Margaret was warm and trusting, the kind of young woman who believed the best of everyone she met, sometimes to her own detriment. At 19, Margaret had fallen deeply in love with a young officer stationed near their family's estate. He had been charming and attentive, full of promises about a future together, and Margaret, swept up in her first real romance, had believed every word. When the officer's regiment was suddenly transferred overseas, he left without a proper farewell, and it was only weeks later that Margaret discovered she was carrying his child. She was unmarried, frightened, and utterly without anyone to turn to. Their father, a proud and traditional man, had strict and unforgiving views about such matters. Margaret knew, without any doubt, that if he discovered her condition, the consequences would be severe. She might be sent away in disgrace, cut off from the family entirely, her reputation destroyed beyond repair, and her future, whatever it might have been, erased completely. In her desperation, Margaret turned to the one person she trusted absolutely, her older sister, Catherine. She arrived at Ashworth House late one evening, shaking and in tears, and begged Catherine for help. She begged her, above all else, to keep the secret from their father and from anyone else who might let it slip to him. Catherine did not hesitate. She arranged, within hours, for a hired carriage to take them to a quiet cottage 2 counties away, owned by a distant family friend who could be trusted to ask no questions. There, Catherine paid for a respected physician and a midwife to attend to Margaret, ensuring she received proper care during what would prove to be a difficult and frightening labor. The birth itself was early and complicated, and for several hours, Catherine sat beside her sister's bed, holding her hand, terrified she might lose her. By the time both mother and child were safe and stable, 3 days had passed. Margaret, still weak but recovering, made arrangements with the family friend to stay at the cottage a while longer, under a quiet cover story about visiting distant relatives, while she decided what to do next. The child would eventually be placed, through careful and loving arrangement, with a kind family who could not have children of their own, a decision made with great sorrow, but also great care, as Margaret was not yet able to raise a child alone and in secret. Through all of this, Margaret begged Catherine to tell no one, not even Edmund. She was terrified that even the smallest whisper of the truth might somehow reach their father, whose temper and rigid views she feared above all else. Catherine had tried, gently, to suggest that surely Edmund could be trusted with such a secret, that he loved her and would understand. But Margaret's fear was absolute, born from years of watching their father's harsh judgments fall on others who had made far smaller mistakes. She made Catherine promise, again and again, until Catherine finally agreed. It was a promise Catherine kept, even as it cost her everything. She returned home to Ashworth House believing, with the kind of quiet faith only the deeply loving possess, that her husband's love for her was strong enough to survive a little uncertainty, that he would trust her, even without an explanation, that their years together had built something sturdy enough to weather this one silence. She was wrong, though not because Edmund did not love her. She was wrong because Edmund's pride had always been more powerful than his trust, and he had never been tested in quite this way before. For 5 long years, Catherine carried this secret alone, watching her marriage crumble around her, never once considering that breaking her promise to her sister might have saved it. She believed, with a kind of stubborn nobility, that some promises mattered more than personal happiness. She told herself that Edmund's coldness was a price worth paying for Margaret's safety, for the safety of an innocent child who now lived happily, unaware of the sacrifices made on his behalf. Margaret, meanwhile, had rebuilt her own life. 2 years after the events at the cottage, she met a kind and gentle man while staying with relatives abroad, a merchant with no knowledge of her past and no interest in judging her for things he did not know. They married, and Margaret found in him a steady, loving companion. She eventually told him the truth of her past, and rather than rejecting her, he held her and told her that the woman she had become mattered far more to him than the mistakes of her youth. Together, they built a happy life, far from the rigid judgments of her father's household. But Margaret never forgot what her secret had cost her sister. Over the years, she received occasional letters from home, and through these letters, she slowly pieced together the truth. That Catherine's marriage had become a cold and distant thing, that the Duke barely spoke to his wife, that rumors of scandal and betrayal followed Catherine through every social circle she still moved within. Margaret's heart broke a little more with each letter. She understood, finally and completely, that her sister had been paying for a debt that was never truly hers. It took Margaret another 3 years to find the courage to act. She worried, constantly, about breaking the promise she had once begged Catherine to keep. But she worried more, in the end, about watching 2 good people waste their lives over a misunderstanding that she alone had the power to fix. She thought of her own husband, of the happiness she had found because someone had chosen to trust her with the truth rather than judge her for a mistake. She thought of her sister, alone in that great cold house, growing older with no warmth and no companionship, simply because she had once chosen loyalty over self-preservation. So Margaret wrote a letter, not to Catherine, but to Edmund himself. She wrote with great care, choosing each word carefully, knowing this letter might either heal a broken family or cause further harm. She explained everything: the officer, the pregnancy, the fear of their father, the cottage, the physician, the long and frightening labor, and her sister's unwavering protection throughout it all. She explained that Catherine's silence had never been about betrayal, but about a desperate, loving promise made to protect someone who had nowhere else to turn. She ended the letter with a simple, heartfelt plea that whatever anger Edmund still carried, he direct it toward her, the true keeper of the secret, and not toward the sister who had sacrificed her own happiness to protect her. The letter arrived at Ashworth House on an ordinary Tuesday morning, delivered along with the usual stack of business correspondence. Edmund almost set it aside, assuming it to be nothing more than another invitation or request for charitable donation. It was only the unfamiliar handwriting and the foreign postmark that made him open it first. He read it once quickly, his mind struggling to absorb the words. Then he read it a second time, more slowly, as the full weight of what he had done over the past 5 years began to settle into his chest like a stone. By the third reading, his hands were trembling, and he found that he could not stand. He sat in his study chair for a long while, the letter resting on his desk, staring at nothing in particular, while 5 years of pride and coldness rearranged themselves into a single, devastating realization. He had judged his wife guilty of betrayal without ever once truly asking why. He had assumed dishonesty where there had only ever been sacrifice. He had let his pride convince him that walking away was strength, when in truth, it had only been cowardice, dressed in the clothing of dignity. Catherine had given up everything: his trust, his affection, 5 years of companionship, to protect a sister who needed her, and she had done so without a single word of complaint, without ever once trying to defend herself at her sister's expense. Edmund did not know, in that moment, how he would face her. What words could possibly undo 5 years of cold silence? What apology could be sufficient for the years she had lost, sitting alone in the East Wing, while he treated her as though she were a stranger in her own home? He found her, eventually, in the garden behind the East Wing, sitting on a stone bench beneath an old oak tree, a book resting unopened in her lap. She had grown thinner over the years, and there were faint lines around her eyes that had not been there before, marks left by years of quiet sorrow. She looked up as he approached, surprise flickering briefly across her face, since he so rarely visited that part of the house anymore. He did not speak at first. He simply sat down beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, something he had not done in 5 years. Catherine watched him carefully, uncertain what this sudden closeness meant. "I received a letter today," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. "From Margaret." Catherine's breath caught. Her hands tightened slightly around the book in her lap, but she said nothing, waiting to see what he would say next. "I know what the 3 days were," Edmund continued. "I know about the cottage, the physician, the child. I know why you couldn't tell me, and I know what it cost you to keep that promise." For a long moment, Catherine said nothing at all. 5 years of carefully guarded composure finally began to crack, though she did not cry, as though she had used up whatever tears this particular wound might have produced long ago. "What took so long?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted sadness. "Pride," Edmund admitted, the word feeling strange and heavy on his tongue, as though he had never truly said it aloud before. "I decided, the moment you walked through that door 5 years ago, that I already knew the worst of you. I never once stopped to consider that I might be wrong. I never asked the right questions. I simply judged, and then I punished you for a crime I invented in my own mind." Catherine looked down at her hands. "I should have trusted you with the truth, regardless of my promise to Margaret. Perhaps if I had—" "No," Edmund interrupted gently. "You kept a promise to someone who needed you desperately. That is not a fault, Catherine. That is exactly the kind of loyalty I always claimed to value most. And yet I could not see it standing right in front of me, because I was too busy feeling wrong to look closely enough." They sat together in silence for a while after that, the late afternoon sun filtering gently through the leaves above them. There were no grand declarations, no sudden embraces, no immediate return to the warmth they had once shared. 5 years of distance could not be undone in a single conversation, no matter how honest. But something had shifted between them, a door that had been locked for half a decade, slowly creaking open once more. In the months that followed, Edmund worked carefully and patiently to rebuild what his pride had nearly destroyed. He did not expect immediate forgiveness, nor did he demand it. Instead, he began with small, steady gestures, joining Catherine for meals again, asking genuine questions about her days, listening, truly listening, to her answers in a way he had not done in years. He learned, slowly, the small details of the life she had built for herself during their separation, which flowers she had planted in the East Wing gardens, which books had become her quiet companions, which of the household staff she had come to consider friends. Catherine, for her part, found that forgiveness did not arrive all at once, but rather in small pieces, gathered slowly over many weeks. She watched Edmund's efforts carefully at first, cautious of trusting too quickly after so much hurt. But his consistency, his willingness to admit fault without excuse, and his patience in the face of her caution, slowly began to soften the walls she had built around her own heart. It took nearly a year before the warmth between them began to feel natural again, rather than effortful. They began taking walks together through the estate grounds, much as they had in the earliest days of their marriage. They began sharing quiet evenings in the library, reading separately but together, content simply to be in each other's company once more. The household staff noticed the change first, whispering quietly among themselves about the return of laughter to the great house, about the Duke and Duchess once again sharing breakfast each morning, about the way Edmund's eyes softened whenever Catherine entered a room. Margaret eventually visited Ashworth House for the first time in many years, nervous about how she might be received after the letter that had changed everything. She found, to her great relief, that Edmund greeted her, not with anger, but with quiet gratitude, thanking her for the courage it had taken to finally tell the truth. The three of them sat together for hours that evening, speaking openly about everything that had happened, allowing old wounds to finally begin healing in the light of honest conversation. Edmund never forgot the lesson those 5 lost years had taught him. He came to understand, in a way he never had before, that loyalty sometimes wears unexpected faces, that silence is not always the same as betrayal, and that love built on assumption rather than trust is no real love at all. He and Catherine spent the remaining years of their marriage making up, as best they could, for the time they had lost, not by dwelling on what had been taken from them, but by cherishing, with renewed appreciation, everything they still had left to share.